Thank you, folks. Let me take off some of these layers. It's not quite as cold as I thought it was going to be. It's always good to be back in Lummi country, and I thank you, Mr. Ballou, for your kind words, and you're welcome. Yeah, I've known Rita for a number of years now, and I've seen her grow into a really smart and dynamic young scholar, and I'm happy that Northwest brought her on full time, although I hope it doesn't interfere too much with her own graduate work and getting that done. Can you hear me all right back there? Okay, good. I'm Lumbee from North Carolina, and I knew Steve from the early 1980s when we were students of Vine Deloria. And so it's still difficult coming back here and not seeing Steve in his office up on the second floor there. But we move on and keep doing what we need to do. But I'll keep coming every summer as long as the Deloria Symposium is offered. And I know that Emma's committed to that, and the college is committed to that, and that's a great thing. How many students do we have here? Very good, excellent, excellent. Before getting to the gist of my remarks, I wanted to mention a few things in the form of questions, right? Mr. Blue mentioned the importance of questions, and they are critical to our development as human beings, and Vine Deloria certainly drove that point home to me many, many times. And these are questions that we need to bear in mind as we look to continue the important work that we're all engaged in to help ourselves, our families, our clans, and our nations. First, Deloria, to my mind the greatest Native intellectual, once asked this important question. He said, "What shall be the true and accepted meaning of our tribal nations? Are we primarily political, legal bodies, racial groups, corporate entities, or are we spiritual and religious communities connected by kinship?" He believed that we were once the latter, but that we were moving farther and farther away from that, to the detriment of our very existence. And that very question is what has been driving the book on tribal disenrollment that Shelley and I are working on. I'm happy to report I just finished a draft of it a couple of weeks ago, and now it's a matter of getting it tightened up and ready for the publisher sometime in the spring. Because as many of you know, a number of tribes have been casting out otherwise bona fide citizens on an alarming scale. And so that question of who are we? How do we define our nations today is absolutely critical. Second, what should our intergovernmental relationship as the original nations be to the state and the federal government? Are we minority groups, ethnic groups, interest groups, corporations, sovereign nations, or are we in fact all the above? And then why does it matter? And of course it does matter. And we are, in fact, we have elements of all those statuses. And that's part of the issue that drives this talk that I'm working on today. The various statuses that we have amassed in the course of time. Third, where, if at all, do we or should we fit in the framework of U.S. federalism that constitutionally connects the states and the federal government, but only mentions us as excluding Indians not taxed and in the Commerce Clause, right? Are we, in other words, constitutional entities, or do we remain extra-constitutional bodies outside of the framework of the Constitution? See? That was always Deloria's argument, that we remain extra-constitutional because the U.S. Constitution doesn't apply to us inside our borders, right? The federal government inserts itself when it chooses, but that's based on other powers that it has given itself. So the whole issue of how we constitutionally fit or do not fit is a powerful one. And that has also been a question that has driven a lot of my political work over the years. As we ponder these questions, that should always be on the tips of every Native citizen's tongue. We would do wise to bear in mind the following statement from Deloria. Something he asked of every Native person, regardless of age, to consider as they pursued their education. And this was a question that appeared in a series of essays that Vine wrote for Winds of Change, the Journal of ACES, the American Indian Science and Engineering Society. articles he wrote specifically for Native college students. And here's what he said in one of those pieces. Indian students must therefore look at their professional education not simply from its set of coherent internal logics, which make the professional field unique, but also from two additional perspectives. How does what we receive in our educational experience impact the preservation and sensible use of our lands and waters? And how does it affect the continuing existence of our nations? I mean, those are two powerful questions, and if we would ask them of ourselves every day that we begin our work, whatever it is we're working on, we would be making contributions continuously to the enrichment and the strengthening and the development of our peoples. I'm, as I said, Lumbee from North Carolina, but I'm trained as a political scientist. And even before I did my graduate work, I was studying and researching the ways in which Native peoples, those of my own nation and others in North Carolina, govern themselves and sought to improve our standing vis-a-vis the federal government and the state. I left that position with the State Department of Archives in North Carolina to work on my master's with Deloria in 1980. And I secured my master's with him. Brian was what Steve and I used to call the godfather of Native intellectuals. And my research and political interest expanded immensely during those 2 years that I worked under him. And our relationship, fortunately for me, continued to grow and develop long after those years. Two broad questions have taken up most of my time for the better part of the last 30 years. I really am getting up there in age a little bit when I put that figure down. I said, oh my God. First, I've always wanted to understand how and why the colonial, state, and federal governments adopted the treaties, statutes, judicial rulings, and policies they did with regard to our nations, and why they've always maintained a schizophrenic position toward us. Why have they not been able to arrive at a consistent understanding of how they want to deal with our peoples? And second, I've always wanted to understand how our peoples were politically and legally organized, and how the arrival of Europeans and others affected our self-governing capabilities. Both BC, that is before Collier, not before Christ, but before John Collier, Felix Cohen and Nathan Margot came on the scene in the 1930s, and since then as well. My earlier works focused largely on the first question, but in the last several years, I've been intent on understanding historical governing structures, values, systems, and patterns that our peoples historically operated under. And I've been especially keen on learning what kinds of political, legal, cultural, and institutional adaptations we made once we had sustained contact with the foreign bodies that set up permanent place on our lands. And as I said, my current project, as some of you know, is studying how and why some of our nations are now dismembering otherwise bona fide members from their nations. But today I want to more closely examine why our relationship within the U.S. and the states continues to be uneven and truly confounding. Our peoples and the distinctive nations we belong to exist in a paradoxical world. We are the original peoples of this land, a fact that is enshrined in the U.S. Constitution's Commerce Clause and the nearly 400 ratified treaties that our ancestors signed with the foreign powers, the states, and the federal government. Yet since very early on, this nation-to-nation relationship, the United States has frequently diminished our abilities to act as political and legal and cultural sovereigns. Profound loss of land. We lost 98% of our territory to non-Indians. Devastated the ability of our peoples to support ourselves. And congressional and administrative constraints on the use of our remaining resources further diminish our capacity to act as political and legal and economic sovereigns. While over time our nations adapted to the land loss and worked to renegotiate resource regulations, in the 1950s and 1960s, a number of Native communities also confronted the reality that their actual political and legal existence could be, and in some cases were, terminated, right, by the federal government. What is the basis for our ongoing paradoxical status in the law, politics, and public opinion? And why is it even those native nations with impressive gaming revenue, or those with significant natural resource endowments of coal, natural gas, timber, the beautiful salmon that you have here, still lag behind the rest of society in virtually every socioeconomic category? Why do our peoples continue to suffer higher rates of poverty, domestic violence, suicide, poor educational attainment that you're changing, and substandard housing? Why do we exhibit proportionally higher numbers of diseases and other devastating problems? We all know that alcohol and drugs continue to be a scourge on our peoples, especially our youth. Many of the problems that continue to bedevil our peoples were previously illuminated by none other than Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, interestingly enough, in an opinion that he drafted in 2004, a case called United States versus Lara. Thomas is, of course, no friend of ours, right? In fact, he's one of our deadliest enemies. But his concurring opinion in the Lara case contained the seeds of some of the hard truths that we face as ongoing nations. Lara involved the application of the constitutional double jeopardy clause and the issue of whether Congress had authority to restore to our nations authority over all Indians within their borders. The usually silent Thomas accurately remarked in his written decision, and here I'm quoting him, he said, "Federal Indian policy is, to say the least, schizophrenic." And then he went on to prove the point by asserting that tribal nations, and this is another direct quote from him, are not part of the United States constitutional order, and their sovereignty is not guaranteed by it. That's a powerful statement when you think about that, right? It's obvious that we are not part of the U.S. constitutional order because we were not sitting in Philadelphia drafting that document, but to say that our sovereignty is not guaranteed by it is a powerfully damning statement, right? And it's true, right? Because our peoples have been snuffed out politically, right? As they were during the termination. And that is a Damocles sword that the federal government can wield whenever it chooses to. These two paradoxical statements powerfully reveal a harsh reality for our nations. Since the founding of the American Republic, a combination of legal doctrines, myths and stereotypes, and congressional presumptions place our peoples, despite our treaties, despite the trust relationship, and our late secured American citizenship, in a fundamentally tenuous position vis-a-vis the U.S. government. While legal doctrines like plenary power, trust, and the ever-destructive discovery doctrine continue to plague us, you also have the many myths and stereotypes. Noble savages, ignoble savages, rich Indian savages, always savages, right? That term always sort of predates any stereotype that is out there. The teary-eyed environmentalists, dependent wars, etc., are important. But then you have Congress's presumptions. And that is important because Congress is the body identified in the U.S. Constitution that determines what the United States policy will be towards us, right? And so here I'm returning to Brian DeLore, who wrote a great little article in the early 1970s, actually, when he was a relatively young man, in which he talked about some of these major congressional presumptions that continue to undergird and overarch the federal government's relationship to us. And as long as these presumptions continue, our status is problematic, right? And here are 5 of them that he emphasized in this article, and I think they're really important. First, he said, Congress, and by extension, the U.S. President and the courts, is generally presumed to always act in good faith towards us, and says that it has the best interests, that it has our best interests in heart. This notion of good faith dates back to 1787, the Northwest Ordinance that the government developed, by which on the one hand the federal government laid out its policy for organizing and governing the national domain west of the Appalachian Mountains, but also pledged that, quote, the utmost good faith shall always be observed toward the Indians. And that's a quote that gets cited time and time again. Obama likes to trot it out whenever he's trying to sidle up next to some of our people. This important ordinance enshrined a schizophrenic federal land policy, inevitable Western expansion into Indian country, while presumably exercising respect for native land rights. See? How can you do both of those simultaneously, right? And yet that's the policy that is still there, because the Northwest Ordinance is one of the organic bedrock governing documents of the federal government. But that notion of good faith, see, people think that in Congress. They think they're always acting in good faith, and yet we know that the reality is something different. A second controlling assumption has been the idea that the solution to indigenous problems is only a matter of a simple readjustment of pre-existing programs and policies. Rarely do change agents investigate the ideological or structural underpinnings, thank you, of federal programs, laws, or doctrines, believing instead that the basic federal structure and legal arrangements are sound, and that all that is needed is a minor tweaking of the system or its component parts. This is evident in the recent Cobell class action settlement. Despite reams of evidence and several court opinions that the BIA and the Department of Interior had mismanaged Indian trust accounts for well over a century, the Bureau, the major culprit of the mismanagement, was entrusted by Congress with the authority to use $1.9 billion of the settlement package to devise a land consolidation plan to address the problems that the Bureau had itself created. See, you with me? So we don't need a minor tweaking, we need a revolution of change, right? A third destructive congressional assumption is the long-held notion that native lands, resources, and rights are little more than social laboratories, which may be legitimately used to test various theories of social, political, and even scientific engineering. This deliberate engineering is grossly evident in policies like Indian removal, land allotment, boarding schools, the culturally destructive civilization campaign of the late 1800s and early 1900s, the IRA of the 1930s, termination in the 1950s and 60s, relocation in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, and non-renewable energy extraction within native-held lands from the 70s to the present, right? And of course, your folks are now dealing with the oil trains and the coal trains, right? They think they can just trace those resources right through your land, as if, there aren't going to be consequences, environmental consequences. So that's a presumption that Congress has, that they can just use our lands any way that suits their interest, right? And we're supposed to just sort of accept that because they have our best interests in heart, right? Fourth, there is a widely held presumption, too frequently shared by members of the relevant congressional committees, that reservations and other tribal trust lands and the governing bodies of those lands are merely temporary entities, mere nuisances that are inevitably slated to fade away or to be made to fade away at the will and timetable set by the federal and state governments. Evidence of this also abounds. For instance, native governments have often struggled when they have attempted to institute taxation programs to generate much needed revenue. The Navajo Nation, one of the most sophisticated models of indigenous financial leadership, was in 2001 denied the right to extend their taxing authority over a hotel operating within their boundaries. This superseding opinion struck at the heart of the tribe's efforts to raise desperately needed money for its growing population. And more recently, in 2009, the Supreme Court held in an important case, Kacheri versus Salazar, that the Narragansett people, a small tribe in Rhode Island, that had received federal recognition in 1983, was not authorized to have the Secretary of Interior put into trust 30 acres of land that the tribe had purchased, right? Thus making that land subject to state taxation and therefore state foreclosure. The court's major and largely arbitrary rationale for this decision was that only Native nations who had been recognized on or before John Collier in 1934 were eligible to have their lands placed into trust. So any tribe recognized since 1934 can't do that now unless they deal directly with the Secretary of Interior, and that has proven to be very difficult. And finally, there is a presumption that since Indian tribes are mentioned explicitly in the Commerce Clause, making Indian affairs an explicit congressional responsibility, the executive and judicial branches can opt out, can choose not to get directly involved in the political and legal rights of Native peoples or individuals. This deference to Congress has both historically and contemporary left tribal treaty rights to the mercies of both the political winds of the day and their interpretation by the judicial branch, which generally acquiesces to Congress's will. Right? The court occasionally rules in a different direction than the political branches, but more often than not, it follows what the political branches want it to follow. This was evidenced in one of the earliest Supreme Court decisions, Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, which many of you are familiar with, in 1831, when the court turned a deaf ear to the legitimate complaints of the Cherokee Nation, whose lands were being overrun by Georgia's legislative expansionism in direct violation of numerous treaties that had been negotiated between the Cherokee Nation and the U.S. And in 2004, Billy Joe Lara, a Turtle Mountain Ojibwe who committed a crime on the Spirit Lake Reservation in North Dakota, was charged and tried by both the Spirit Lake government and the federal government. Lara claimed that the federal government's legal action violated the Double Jeopardy Clause of the Constitution, but the court held that Congress, as a separate and superior sovereign, had plenary power under the Commerce Clause over both Indian affairs and Native nations, and could use that authority not only to prosecute Lara, but more broadly to either restrict or to relax restrictions on tribal sovereignty. In the court's own words, the Congress can recognize, or more ominously even deny, the existence of tribal sovereign power. Placing such unlimited authority in the hands of the legislative branch, generally acquiesced to by the Supreme Court and executive branch, means that the democratic principles of checks and balances and separation of powers, a hallmark of American democracy, rarely come into play in terms of our standing, especially in terms of relationships with the federal government. These congressional presumptions, when linked with key legal doctrines, tensions in federalism, powerful and persistent myths and stereotypes, and of course, the ever-present racism, mean that the United States will likely always have a perfectly inconsistent relationship with our nations. Now, a brief, though not exhaustive, list of some of this ambivalence or indeterminacy in federal law and policy, each rooted in legal precedent and political principle, will make abundantly clear why we enjoy little stability in our internal and external affairs. First, we are sometimes referred to as alien nations or distinct and independent political bodies capable of exercising a measure of sovereign power. But then we are also sometimes described as merely domestic dependent nations, limited to exercising a reduced degree of internal sovereignty and subject to federal dominance and increasingly state interference. Second, tribal sovereignty has been defined as inherent and reserved, but our nations have also been informed that we can only exercise those powers that the federal government gives to us, right? Out of the kindness of their institutional hearts, right? Third, the tribal-federal relationship has sometimes been described as that of a trustee-beneficiary, right? With us being the beneficiaries, the federal government, the trust agent. But on the other hand, the same players have been described as having a guardian-ward relationship, right? A trusteeship is a relationship that limits the private rights of the trustee, not us, right? The federal government is the one that's supposed to have all the constraints, not us. We're supposed to benefit from our trust agent. Whereas in a guardian-ward relationship, the ward's rights are always restricted by the guardian. In fact, we have never been wards of the United States. At no point in history. There's no treaty that contains that language, no statute that ever contained that language. And yet that is a perception that still persists, right? We have to break that perception. Fourth, a number of court cases have held that general acts of Congress are inapplicable to our nations unless we are specifically mentioned in the legislation. because of our extra constitutional status, right? That's one perspective, and you can find cases that support that view. On the other hand, there are other court cases that say our nations are in fact subject to general acts of Congress unless we are specifically exempted from the legislation, right? Two very different perspectives, and yet they both coexist simultaneously in the law, right? How can you establish a formal, strong, understandable status when something as basic as that isn't clear in the law itself? That's a real problem. Fifth, the federal government has sometimes acknowledged that its political power in relation to our peoples is limited and must be based on specifically enumerated constitutional clauses: commerce, treaty, property. Those are three dominant constitutional clauses. On the other hand, federal law also asserts that the U.S. has virtually unlimited power over us, right? Plenary power is the term that courts have coined. Over us, over our lands, over our rights, over everything that we are, right? Those two very different realities also coexist simultaneously in the law, leading to great confusion as to what our status actually is. And then finally, there is much evidence that state laws have no force within any country because of tribal sovereignty, federal supremacy under the Commerce Clause, and state constitutional disclaimer clauses. Right? You folks know that here in Washington State, there is a clause in Washington State's Constitution that says it does not have the power to tax. It does not have any power, any jurisdictional power over Indian lands. Right? In fact, I went to your Constitution, the state's Constitution, yesterday, and I printed off the article. It's Article 26 of Washington's Constitution. It says that the people inhabiting this state do agree and declare that they forever disclaim all right and title to the unappropriated public lands lying within the boundaries of the state and to all lands lying within said limits owned or held by any Indian or Indian tribes. And that until the title thereto shall have been extinguished by the U.S., the same shall be and remain subject to the disposition of the U.S., and said Indian lands shall remain under the absolute jurisdiction and control of the Congress of the U.S., and that the land shall never be taxed. Right? So this is in your Constitution, this state's Constitution. It's in 9 other Western states' constitutions. And states have frequently violated their own constitutional charters. When I first learned about this, when I was teaching at Nauvoo Community College in the 1980s, I immediately called up Vine. I said, Vine, you know about these disclaimer clauses? He said, hell yeah, Wilkins, write an article about it. And so I did. And yet trying to get people to act upon it is something else, right? So the state has no authority, all right? Because Congress told them before you can even become a state, you have to agree that you cannot tax Indian lands, all right? Unless we give you that authority, right? So that's important. I wanted to share that with you. And of course, despite all the law and the treaties and these clauses that preclude state involvement, there is, of course, contrary evidence and contrary federal laws which authorize states to come into our territory, right? Like Public Law 280 that Congress adopted in 1953. And the people of this state are now subject to that, although John McCoy, because of this legislation, has been able to empower tribes to take that back from the state, right? So we're finally making progress on that front as well. So the multiple overlapping and often contradictory manifestations of indigenous status have arisen from the American public's curiously ambivalent view of our peoples, historically contradictory Supreme Court precedents. I say historically because the Roberts Court has been very consistent in its anti-indigenous cases, right? Vacillating congressional presumptions and statutes, the long and complicated treaty and agreement record, Byzantine administrative regulations, how federalism is defined, on whether or not the trust doctrine has any meaning at all anymore, and on whether or not tribal sovereignty is a respected reality, right? Over time and in entirely unpredictable and ad hoc ways, the statuses have expanded and multiplied, but their lineage traces to the earliest moments of the U.S. history, although one could easily push it back to the 16th century theological debates in Spain about whether or not indigenous peoples were free persons or slaves. Right? So there's a whole history there that needs to be laid out and has been laid out. Now, on the one hand, such indeterminacy about our status accords imaginative tribal leaders, American presidents and their agents, federal judges, congressional lawmakers, and even state officials with a great degree of flexibility, right? Involved parties may successfully navigate otherwise difficult political terrain by choosing appropriate indigenous statuses that can benefit our nations, right? Which is why political leadership is critical, right, for our peoples. On the other hand, and of greater import, such ambivalence deprives Native peoples collectively and singly of a clear and consistent standing regarding the powers and rights that we can exercise, thereby contributing to the ongoing tension that frequently clouds the relationship between our nations and other political and corporate bodies. What can be done to clarify this hornet's nest of statuses? I suggest that Congress, working closely with our governments, should act under its plenary exclusive power. Not plenary absolute power, but plenary exclusive power. To clarify what rights our nations and our citizens possess and may exercise under treaties, trust, and statutory law, based on our sovereign national status, right? Tax exemptions, the right to hunt and fish, sovereign immunity protections, and racial preferences as well. Congress should also clarify in direct partnership with our nations what rights our peoples and their citizens possess and may exercise under the status as federal and state citizens or as subunits of governments, e.g. funds for highways, certain social services, unemployment compensation, and the right to contract and to buy cell phones or something like that. And they should then educate the American public about how these two broad statuses, Native nations as sovereign governments, whose citizens also happen to be U.S. and state citizens, are not in fact irreconcilable, right? That's not an easy thing to do, but it's critical that they do their part to explain that to the American people. Why should the burden be on us to explain them what they have created, you see? And yet we need to keep educating ourselves, of course, but the Congress needs to do its job. Congress should finally clarify its own responsibilities in the field of Indian affairs. When our nations are statutorily accorded a status as a corporation, which some of us who adopted the IRA were, or are treated as states, TAS status, for purposes of environmental and tax laws, are these political statuses that trace back to our aboriginal status as pre-existing sovereigns? Or are they merely devolutions of federal power to our nations, which for purposes of the specific statute act as federal instrumentalities or arms of the government? See? Again, this is a very confused and yet powerful set of different statuses that have not been clarified despite 200 years of history together, right? So this strikes at the heart of one of the most important questions that Native, federal, and state policymakers must address. Are we, as Native peoples, inherent sovereigns, acting as policy partners with the U.S. and the states, and that's the view of most indigenous peoples, actually all indigenous peoples, I think, or are we diminished units of governments entitled to exercise only those powers expressly delegated to us by the Congress, the view of a small but powerful group of U.S. policymakers, and unfortunately a majority of the current Supreme Court justices? In fact, in having studied this dynamic relationship for 3 decades, I say reluctantly, I believe in conclusion that there are 3 reasons why the federal government's political will has nearly always benefited itself and only occasionally has rendered small victories for our nations. First, the federal government's reluctance and or unwillingness to acknowledge indigenous legal and political and cultural traditions stem from the ambitious drive of national and state politicians, the legal establishment, business entrepreneurs, and white settlers to ensure that nothing derail Euro-America's expansion from a fledgling national polity to an internationally recognized industrial, now post-industrial state wielding unprecedented power. Right? The United States was not going to be denied, right? Despite everything that we've tried to use to stop them. Right? Second, even when the U.S. says that it adheres to a trust relationship with our peoples, defined here as a relationship in which the federal government acknowledges a legal and moral duty to assist our nations in the protection of our remaining lands, resources, and cultural heritage, said to be based on the highest standards of good faith and honesty, it still frequently acts, as it said in U.S. versus Hickory Apache, a major Supreme Court decision in 2011, in ways that support its own interest over even those of us, the so-called trust beneficiaries. Justice Samuel Alito wrote the opinion in the Hickory case, and he said, and I quote here, "Because the Indian trust relationship represents an exercise of that authority, we have explained that the government has the real and direct interest in the guardianship," and there's the word, guardianship, "it exercises over the Indian tribes. This is especially so because the government has often structured the trust relationship to pursue its own policy goals." See, think about that. They set up a trust relationship to pursue their interests, even when they conflict with ours. Thus, while trust administration relates to the welfare of the Indians, the maintenance of the limitations which Congress has prescribed as part of its plan of distribution is distinctly an interest of the U.S. And later, Alito said it even more pithily. I like that word, pithy. That's just a nice little word. He said, while one purpose of the Indian trust relationship is to benefit the tribes, the government has its own independent interests in the implementation of federal Indian policy. See, that's a scary sentence right there, folks, right? Its own interest. So they're going to do what's going to benefit them, right? And sometimes that happens to benefit us, but we can't bank on that. We can't rely on that. We can't wait for that, right? Because they're always going to be about preserving their interests, right? And then finally, David Williams, who's a lawyer, wrote an essay describing why, in his opinion, the United States is unwilling to truly engage in complete reparations for Native peoples. And he made this statement, and it's a little bit of a long quote, but it's really, really powerful, and I want to share it with you, and I'm going to end on that, end with this quote. He said, "I propose a different explanation for the reluctance to grant reparations to tribes. They are collective sovereigns asking for reparations for the unjust taking of their sovereignty. But the U.S. is extremely reluctant to acknowledge that the taking of sovereignty was unjust because America came into legal being only by that taking." Huh? America could have territory for its own legal system only by displacing the legal system of the sovereigns already here. All right? To call that displacement a wrong is to call America's own legitimacy into question. And it should not come as a surprise that the courts and Congress of the U.S. would be reluctant to question the basis of their own sovereign power. Indeed, American sovereign actors could not logically take sovereign action that would deny the legitimacy of their own sovereignty, because then they would have no ability to take sovereign action in the first place. Right? That's a real meaty kind of sentence right there, folks, right? And yet I think it packs in and it captures the essence of why our status is always going to be problematic, right? Because we stand in direct contrast, right? Because everything that the United States has, they built it over us, frequently in direct violation of their own organic laws and values, right? And it's hard for them to admit that, right? These fundamental realities are probably not resolvable, so the multitude of statuses our peoples have, both collectively and individually, whether possessed inherently, unilaterally laid on us by federal decree, or actively pursued by our nations to improve their governing capabilities, will continue to proliferate. leading to even greater political, cultural, and intergovernmental confusion and tension. And that's where your own work and whatever it is you're engaging in that will benefit your people, hopefully will continue to make some progress to trying to change the existing paradigm. Thank you very much.